In this lecture, we're going to turn from the legislative to the executive branch and look at the kind of consequences that elections have for the presidential administration. I'm going to focus entirely on the federal government for this lecture because things are a bit different at the state level. The multiple executive, as I've talked about in the past, means that there is not such a partisan capture of a state level administration as there is at the federal level. So the Constitution makes Congress the primary policymaking machine, and it seems like winning the presidency and capturing essentially control over the executive branch would really be secondary politically in terms of furthering your policy agenda to capturing majorities in Congress. And that's true in a certain way, but it has become less and less true over the decades as Congress has created within the executive branch more and more policymaking power. As the world became more complex, as policymaking needed to be done on a more sort of day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis and not on the big, long cycles that Congress can make policy, Congress turned over more and more policymaking power to the executive branch, created, in fact, independent agencies with regulatory power, which is essentially the ability to make laws in the executive branch. Now, Congress always has the power to override any action, any regulation, any executive order that comes from the executive branch. But because of the difficulties of getting things through Congress, and because, first of all, you would need majorities in both houses of Congress that are in opposition to the presidential administration to even want to do that. And even then, it's very difficult to do that because of the difficulties of getting your caucus unified for, say, a repeal of a regulation passed by the FCC. So the executive branch actually has quite a bit of policymaking power. It itself is a secondary policymaking machine with the potential for as much as or more output than Congress. And especially as the partisan divide has increased, I talked about in the last lecture, and made it more difficult for Congress to take action, the center of gravity of policymaking in the federal government has shifted significantly towards the executive branch. So that's an obvious reason why capturing the executive branch is really important. It's also a very straightforward, simple prize. It's one office. In order to get a majority control over Congress, you have to win elections in two different bodies, and you have to have a majority in two different bodies with two different types of electorates. The House has district-based electorates, the Senate has state-based electorates. You have to be able to win a lot of different races to capture and maintain a majority. When a party wins the presidency, it captures the entire executive branch for a 4-year period. And the reason for that is that there is a single elected official in charge of the executive branch, and that elected official, the president, has the ability to appoint people across a broad range of agencies and departments that have a variety of policymaking discretion. Some of those political appointees have very little policymaking discretion, some have a lot of policymaking discretion. Some of the agencies that the president can appoint people to are not fully capturable by that particular president. For example, the FCC, which I just mentioned, is a board made up of 5 people, and they have 6-year terms that overlap. And there's a requirement that there be a partisan balance, that you can never have 4 and 1 or 5 and 0 from one party. So the president can appoint people to fill vacancies, but the FCC can't be moved all at once. Other agencies, like the Environmental Protection Agency, can be changed all at once. So there's a range of automatic discretionary power. There are also certain places where executive orders can turn promises into policy immediately, and other areas where the statutory power of the executive branch is more limited, and so executive orders and policy memos can't just change the way Congress has set things up. For example, the Trump administration could do various things to transform and even undermine the enforcement of the Affordable Care Act, but it couldn't just decide that the Affordable Care Act was gone. You can't just issue an executive order saying we're going to stop doing these things. But for a lot of policies, especially ones that are from previous administrations' executive orders, the presidency carries with it an awful lot of policymaking power. So capturing the executive branch, it's obvious that it's extremely important, and that's the reason why, is that across the broad domain of policymaking entities and areas of policy, environment, healthcare, social welfare, education, energy, all of the policy domains are handled by the executive branch. Now again, in some departments there's more leeway than in others, and Congress always has the ability to override actions of the president, and previous statutes passed by previous Congresses give more or less policy leeway to the executive branch. Now, obviously the capturing the entire executive branch is a big electoral prize. And what's the sort of mechanism that makes that winning that prize turn into policy victories? One of them is that each of the parties essentially has a cadre of political appointees in the waiting. There really are essentially two teams, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that have people who are ready to go into a new administration. In many cases, these are people who have served in previous administrations from that same party. So, for example, if Joe Biden wins the presidential election in 2 days, the Democratic Party has a bunch of people ready to fill all of the thousands of political appointments that an incoming president can fill. Many of those Democratic people have served in previous administrations, definitely in the Obama administration, probably some of the people go back to the Clinton administration. Many of the people who were appointed into the Obama administration had experience in the Clinton administration. And so there's also fresh talent being brought up, and each party essentially has ready an entire set of people to go into every department: Department of Energy, Department of Education, Homeland Security, Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency. There are people who are waiting. And in fact, one of the things that happens, and this is often called sort of derisively the revolving door between public service and the private sector, that revolving door is because administrations change over and people end up going back to the private sector when their party loses control over the executive branch. Sometimes people, of course, cycle back out before the administration changes partisan hands. But for sure, when we go from a Republican president to a Democratic president, almost all of those Republican appointees are going to go back into the private sector somewhere, and sort of the new team is going to come on from the Democratic Party. The sort of revolving door is, as I say, it's referred to sort of derisively a lot of times because it seems to indicate a cozy relationship between the government regulators and the industries and areas of life that are being regulated. And that, of course, when that's the case, you can't help but think, well, the industry is going to get from the government what they want. To a certain extent, that's true, and it's more true in certain areas than in other areas. It's definitely way more true in, for example, defense policy than it is in education policy, because the defense industry is a very large, profitable industry that is purely a private sector, whereas the education industry is more diverse, less profit-oriented. There's a public-private mixture. So the transfer of the revolving door of education policy people is going to be different than the revolving door of defense policy people. And it really does vary quite a bit. Most revolving doors are not quite as straightforwardly sort of self-serving as the defense policy one, or for example, people moving in and out of the FDA and the pharmaceutical industry, where the regulators are going to land when there's a shift in partisan administration, are going to land in a lucrative industry that has a very direct interest in specific kinds of regulations and specific kinds of executive actions. In other areas, the transfer is more ideological. For example, in the Department of Education, when the outgoing Republican administration leaves and Democratic appointees fill the Department of Education with policy appointees, most of those people are not looking ahead to going back into lucrative jobs in the education area. They are coming from areas where they're bringing their ideas and their values into the administration to transform the domain of education. The same thing is true for areas like health and human services and energy. Different policy domains are going to have sort of a cozier or more relaxed financial relationship between the area of life, between the industry that they are regulating. Now, another important thing too is that there's always going to be some material interest in that revolving door, but there's also a value orientation in that. And this is where the partisan administration is so important. When you get the executive branch filled with Republican appointees or Democratic appointees, what you're going to get across the board are people who have a particular orientation on how to use or not use government power. And there is kind of a broad brush to say that, well, Republican appointees tend to favor private sector, free market solutions. They tend to prefer less regulation, less subsidies, lower taxes, a lighter government hand. That's not true across the board, but in broad terms that is. Whereas Democratic appointees tend to see the government as a tool of the social good, that government action can be put to positive use, and government programs should be run effectively and efficiently so that the private sector can be managed, regulated, and controlled. So when you get a Democratic administration, you're going to get policy appointees who are going to see the world through that lens. When you have a Republican administration, you're going to get policy appointees who see the world through that lens. So what you get when you capture the executive branch is you get, across a wide range of policy areas, you get to shift the policy orientation. You get to shift the overall lens so that when lobbyists and interest groups come and look for and ask for and try to push for favorable policies in education or health and human services or energy or immigration or homeland security, that those people are going to have the ears of a particular type of group of people. Republican appointees listening to advocates, lobbyists, interest groups are going to filter that through their generally pro-free market orientation. Democratic appointees are going to filter it generally through their good government, common good kind of orientation. And so the big prize you get when you capture the presidency is you get to have, in a policymaking machine that's vast, diverse, and much easier to move than Congress. Executive actions, whether they be done through a regulatory agency like the Environmental Protection Agency or the FCC, or through one of the cabinet departments like Department of Homeland Security or Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, the executive branch can move more quickly. That's one of the reasons why Congress has shifted some of its policymaking power. When you get a faster policy machine in your hands all at once, that means that you can keep those promises much more easily that were made on the campaign trail. You can enact your party's agenda. You can give people what it is that they think that they want. Now, I talked about in the last lecture, it's dangerous sometimes to give people what they want very directly, the American people, because sometimes when they get it, they're a little, they're like, oh, right, here are the actual consequences of that. Or we thought we wanted that, but we didn't. Or we wanted that, but we wanted it this way, not the way that you're giving it to us. So just as there is with elected officials in the legislature having to make these political calculations about how to fulfill the promises, the same thing is true in the executive branch. But here's the thing. Unlike members of Congress who, when they do or don't take action, or when they vote yes or no on some bill that actually comes up, that's right on their record next time they have to go back and get reelected. If you're a political appointee, you're not necessarily looking over your shoulder at the people because you're not elected. Now, you do, of course, if it's a first term administration, you do, of course, prefer to have your president reelected. And so there will be some looking over the shoulder. And of course, the president, him or herself, is going to be looking over their shoulder at the electorate to see whether or not, to make sure that the people like what's being done. But political appointees who are doing most of the policymaking, they are going to be more oriented towards their own perspective on the world and less oriented towards the people. So there's a removal from that kind of pressure of public opinion, that pressure of thinking about future elections. There's always a concern, right? Because if you're part of the Republican team or the part of the Democratic team, you would prefer for your party to keep control over the executive branch for as many terms of office as possible. Though it's well known that there's a cycle of this, that it's really not going to be the case that one party is going to capture the presidency for 6, 7, 8 terms in a row. 2, 3, 4 would be sort of unprecedented for the last half century. So there's that knowledge that it's cyclical, so you're going to use that power while you have it and not worry too much about how that policy lands in terms of approval and disapproval. So not only does capturing the presidency give you all at once a broad range of policymaking power, it gives you that policymaking power in a way that is freer from public opinion, freer from the concern for the next election. Plus, you have 4 years, right? The next election is not for 4 more years, whereas with congressional elections, the elections are every 2 years. That's really a pretty big difference in terms of the policymaking calendar. You can get a lot done in 4 years. You can get a ton done in 8 years. And so the ability to translate the victory of one office into all kinds of changes in policy that are done relatively quickly without having to worry too much about how it lands with the electorate is what the partisan administration gives you. And parties know this, and winning the presidency is obviously the most important thing for both of the major parties, and that's one of the reasons why they compete so hard for it.